Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our discussion with author Jennifer Haigh. My name is Jean McGuire, and I'm the director here at the Maynard Public Library. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin the program, we would like to offer a land acknowledgement. This land that now constitutes the town of Maynard is part of the ancestral and traditional home of the Nipmuc peoples, who were here for thousands of years before the town was established. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of the land who are not forgotten and whose descendants are still with us here in Massachusetts. Tonight's program is being offered in a hybrid format with some attendees here in the room and some attending online. We are extremely grateful to the Friends of the Maynard Public Library for funding the purchase of the OWL camera, microphone, and speaker device, which enables us to offer hybrid programs like this one. I would also like to express thanks to library staff member Sally Thurston, who has worked hard to help us learn and implement the other arrangements required in order to offer hybrid programs to the community. She may look like she's doing nothing over there and just taking it easy, but she's juggling about 100 different things. So the introduction of our special guest, Jennifer Haigh, will be provided by interviewer Dottie McKean. Dottie is a longtime Maynard resident and an active member of the Friends of the Library, along with other community organizations. We have been the lucky beneficiaries of her knowledge, skills, and good humor. She has prepared quite extensively for tonight's discussion, so I know you and Jennifer are in very good hands. After the introduction, Jennifer will honor us with a reading from her latest book, Mercy Street, interspersed with the conversation that she has with Dottie. And after their conversation, we'll conclude with questions from the audience, both those of you in the room and those of you who are online. For those of you online, please feel free to type your questions into the chat box at any point during the program, and Sally will read as many as she can during the Q&A period. For those of you here in the room, copies of Mercy Street and other titles by Jennifer are available at the table on the right side of the room, courtesy of Porter Square Books, and Jennifer has graciously agreed to sign books for us after the program. We thank Dale and Porter Square Books for being here this evening. Before you leave, we hope you'll also enjoy some of the delicious refreshments kindly provided by the Friends of the Library and take in this beautiful memorial exhibit of seascape watercolors by the artist Sandy Walensky. And now, take it away, Dottie.
Thank you. And we are delighted to have people here. And we are especially delighted to have Jennifer Haigh here, who is not only an incredible author, but she was raised with a librarian. And she is such a good friend to the libraries, and we are so grateful for that. She is the author, I'm going to put my glasses on so I have to stop and see this. She is the author of the highly acclaimed novels, Mrs. Kimble, Baker Towers, The Condition, Faith and Heat and Light, and a book of short stories, News from Heaven. Her books have won the Penn Hemingway Award, the Massachusetts Book Award, and the Penn New England Award in Fiction, and have been published in 18 languages. Jennifer Haigh is a Guggenheim Foundation Fellow and won a Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Tonight, she's here to talk about her most recent book, Mercy Street, which is set in Boston in a women's clinic. I'm going to read you the review by Richard Ford. Mercy Street is a savvy, keen-eyed, witty, wise, and altogether luminous novel, a triumph. Jennifer Haigh is a young master of this form, though at day's end, I would read her just to read her. And Richard Russo said, I am gobsmacked, and I think you will be too. So let's talk about Mercy Street. The New York Times review talked about the fact that this is a very controversial subject. And I have heard you describe abortion as the third rail. And so what made you decide to touch that rail?
Oh, Dottie, I ask myself this question all the time. I was about halfway through writing this book when it occurred to me, I'm gonna have to publish this thing. And suddenly it didn't seem like a very good idea. I started writing this book because I felt it deeply. That's true of all my books. But you know, when I'm writing, I have to really exercise some will to not think about how people are going to react to what I'm writing. If I think about what my editor will think, or what the reviewer for the New York Times book review or my mother will think, forget it, I'll never write another word. Like, I just can't even think about that. And that was particularly true with Mercy Street, because it is a third rail subject. Abortion is a subject where nobody is neutral. Everybody has an opinion, no matter how little they may know about the subject. Everyone has an opinion. And so I realized that I was sort of, walking into something when I wrote this book, but it was a book I had to write. So the way this one came about is very unusual for me. I don't have any autobiographical instinct at all. I really don't write from my own experience. But in this case, I had been volunteering at this clinic for some time. I didn't do it because I wanted to write about it. I did it because I believed in the work they were doing at this clinic. And I'd been working there for a little while when it became clear to me that I was going to have to write this story. And I can tell you exactly the moment when I knew that was true. At this clinic, I was a volunteer on a hotline. So we were answering calls from almost exclusively women, mostly calling from places in New England, a lot of them from in Boston. And as a volunteer, I had been trained to answer these very common questions. They were usually either about contraception or about STDs, or in some cases about scheduling an abortion. So I went through this kind of long, elaborate training to be able to do this. I'm not a medical person, but I knew these subjects. And I would say maybe a quarter of the calls that I answered were related to abortion. If you wanted to schedule the procedure, your first stop was to talk to a volunteer like me, who would talk you through the procedure, answer your questions. Most of the women who called to schedule abortions were very clear about their decisions. They'd been thinking about this long and hard. They really just wanted to schedule the appointment, get it behind them, and get on with their lives. But every once in a while, there would be a caller who wanted to talk about her decision, who needed to process it a little bit. And this was one of those callers. I remember she was calling from a 603 area code, so she was in New Hampshire. And she told me that she had to have an abortion because if her ex found out she was pregnant, he would come to her house and shoot her kids. Now, when I started volunteering on this hotline, I never imagined that this might be a person's reason for choosing abortion. I imagined that most of the patients would be very young, probably still in school, almost certainly unmarried. But I never imagined a woman who was in this dangerous sort of situation for whom being pregnant was an additional danger. This is clearly somebody who had been living with domestic violence already. She'd managed to get out of that relationship, and finding she was pregnant put her in jeopardy again. And so after answering this call, I thought, oh, damn, I have to write this. And I wasn't entirely pleased about that because I knew it would be a hard book to write and a really hard book to publish. Because of my background, I was very familiar with the strong opinions a lot of people have against abortion. I grew up in a tiny little town, middle of nowhere. If you've read some of my other books, you will recognize it as the model for Bakerton, that little town in northern Appalachia, a little dying coal mining town. So that's where I grew up, and went to 12 years of Catholic school. Was raised in an observant Catholic family, the sort of family where there was often a nun or a priest at Sunday dinner. And I'd been hearing about how bad abortion was since before I even understood how you get pregnant. So I was very familiar with these arguments, and I knew that a lot of people, a lot of my readers, were going to have a really bad reaction to me writing about this subject. So I was aware that it was a risky thing to do, but I felt it so strongly that it was just a book I needed to write. So that was the seed for Mercy Street.
You wrote this, it's set in 2015 in Boston, which was the year of the snow. And so you were writing this during Trump's time. Did you realize quite how timely it was going to be when you were writing it?
No, I have no idea. It takes so long to write a novel that if you happen to write something that is timely, that is a sheer accident. Like you could not possibly plan that. There's no way I could have known. I started writing this book in the spring of 2015. Or was it or spring of 2016? I lose track now. But it's true that the entire book was written during Trump's term, and that certainly affected my writing of the book. I mean, it's, my frustration and my anger and my concern over the future of our country was really part of the engine that powered me through the writing of this book. So that's not coincidental. But certainly I never imagined then that we would be on the brink of losing Roe v. Wade as we are now. I never could have known that.
And you chose to set this in Boston because?
Oh, many reasons. First, because it's where I live, it's a place I know well, but also because of Boston's history as possibly the most Catholic city in America. And that is not an accident. That was very much a choice I made setting the story here. Boston is in many ways kind of a post-Catholic city. And I know there are still many, many observant Catholics in Boston, but the church in Boston has taken such a hit in the last 20 years, given that this is where the clergy sex abuse scandal exploded, ground zero for that scandal. It's a fact that church attendance in Boston has plummeted and has stayed down. It hasn't really come back up. And so, Boston has this sort of a unique relationship to this question, I think. And in fact, in the first scene of the book, Claudia, the main character who's a counselor at this clinic, is looking out the window, counting the protesters outside on Ash Wednesday morning. And it's a protest that is being led by Catholic clergy, by Franciscan friars and Catholic priests. And it is something that I was very aware of in the writing of this book. The church has lost a lot of credibility on sexual matters, let's be honest. And yet, here was this protest being led by presumably celibate male Catholic clergy who felt qualified to pass a moral judgment on the women who came to this clinic, not just for abortions, but to get birth control pills, to get an annual exam, to, just take care of their bodies, the most basic maintenance that every female body requires. You go to a clinic like this, and yet all the women who come to this clinic are sort of tarnished with the same brush and assumed to be there for abortions and being judged.
There is a paragraph. One of the things that I have said about, I love her writing. I'm just going to be really clear about that. But one of the things about her books, and we ought to talk about faith at some point too, is that I can open up any of her books to almost any page and find a sentence or a paragraph that I want to share with somebody. And I want to read, this is from Mercy Street. This is just a paragraph at the beginning that talks about the women who come to this clinic. Drug addiction and alcoholism, depression and anxiety, accidental pregnancy, and sexually transmitted disease. These conditions are believed to share a common etiology, the failures of virtue. Whatever their diagnosis, their troubles are seen to be, in part or in full, their own goddamn fault. So anyway, there is, in spite of the fact that this is an extremely serious book, Jennifer writes with a certain amount of humor. And there are these little gems that are just tucked in everywhere. And at the very beginning of the book, Mary and Claudia, who are both workers there, are looking out at the people who are protesting. And Mary, who is also a Catholic with the ashes on her forehead, is saying, they're all men. And Claudia said, no, I think there's a woman there. And the one that is walking up there, she is clearing the snow off the signs. I think that's a woman, and coincidentally, she's cleaning. Mary says, coincidentally. So in addition to, this is certainly a controversial book, but you have written controversial books before. Faith which was based on the priest scandal in Boston, and is written from an interesting point of view in that it is the sister of one of the priests who's accused. And you talked about that as being something you had some background in. The other book that has some controversy in it is Heat and Light. Heat and Light is the book about fracking, but as with, I think, all of your books, rather than writing about the controversy, what Jennifer writes about, I think, is what it does to the people, and what it does to the people who are trying to live on that land is heartbreaking, I think. So let's talk about your place. All of her books, with the exception of Mrs. Kimble, and you said Faith, have some connection to the area that is in Appalachia, the area. And when Richard Russo was reviewing her short story book, which is News from Heaven, he compared it to Sherwood Anderson's book of Weinstrack, Ohio. But I think it reminds me a lot of his own books, his early books that are set in upstate New York, in the factory towns that are also the dying towns. So can you talk a little bit about why that area pulls you back so constantly?
It's surprising to me even, because when I was growing up there, I really felt like I had done something terrible in a past life. And that's why I had to grow up in this god-awful place. So the town I grew up in was a little coal mining town. And by the time I came along, the town was already on its last legs. And by the time I graduated from high school, the mines were finished and people were moving away from this town in droves. So, that the kind of life cycle of this town has been a real subject for me. My second book, Baker Towers, really looks at the town in its heyday when the mines were on fire. And of course, I have no memory of that. I don't have personal memories of the 40s and 50s, but my parents did. And so I think of that book as really a gift from my parents, and particularly from my father, who had an extraordinary memory for detail and was a great storyteller. So that was the first book I wrote about my hometown, because I had always wanted to see what it was like when things were good. I never got to see that, but it was my attempt to time travel back to that time when the town was vibrant, and it was. So after I wrote that book, I thought, okay, I'm done. I never have to write about this town again, because nothing else is ever going to happen there. And I really believed that for a while. But what happened was readers who responded to Baker Towers constantly asked me questions about one particular character, about the brother in the family, Sandy Novak. He's the brother who moves away and sort of never seen again. And so many readers wanted to know what happened to him. So I thought, okay, I'll bite. I'll write a short story about what happened to Sandy Novak. And I did. And that led me to write another short story about Sandy Novak, and then a story about Sandy Novak's sister, Joyce. And before I knew it, I had this collection of short stories set in Bakerton. It's called News from Heaven. And so that was my second Bakerton book. And then I thought, okay, now I'm really done. Like, this is it. It's over. This town is about to dry up and blow away. And then the fracking thing happened in the 2000s, in this part of Pennsylvania, Appalachian Pennsylvania. People were selling off their mineral rights for fracking. And, anything that happens in that part of the world, I'm probably going to end up writing about, because I have such a complicated personal relationship with it. I have such love for that place. And I find that place, crushingly sad also. And so it really affects me. No matter what happens there will affect me. And so that's how those 3 Bakerton books came about. But as Dottie points out, even a couple of my Boston books have a connection to Bakerton. The Condition, and if you read it when it first came out in 2008, you might not remember this, but Frank, the father in the McCotch family, is from Bakerton. And so that there's a line of that story that connects back to my hometown. And Mercy Street, to my great surprise, has a real Bakerton connection as well. And this was not something I foresaw when I started writing the book. When I started writing Mercy Street, I knew that there would have to be an antagonist character to Claudia. And so I invented this character, Victor Prine. Victor is vehemently opposed to abortion, and he is a guy from my hometown. And the way that came about was, when I was growing up there, I told you that this anti-abortion rhetoric was sort of rampant in this very socially conservative Catholic little town. And true story, when I was growing up there, if you drove 10 miles in any direction from my parents' house, you would see a homemade sign planted in somebody's pasture or in somebody's yard. And these signs were not mass produced, right? They were handmade. Somebody went to the lumber yard, bought the lumber, cut the lumber, painted the signs with anti-abortion slogans, and planted them in somebody's yard. They're still up there. I still see them when I go back to visit. I have no idea who makes these. But when I was thinking about the character of Victor Prine, I thought, okay, who made the sign? I'm going to write the guy who made the sign. And that's Victor Prine. And he's very central to Mercy Street. And he's, you know, I don't know the inner lives of guys like Victor Prine, but I feel like I see them all around. Like, I feel like I grew up with them. You know, so he has a lot in common with some men of that generation from my part of the world. And so that was the spark that led to me writing that character.
And one of the things that is wonderful about all of your books is how well developed all of your characters are. And so I guess my question is, how do you get inside the head of someone like Victor? And maybe more importantly, how do you get back out?
Well, you know, it's some characters are easy because they're close to me. So the character of Claudia, who's very central in Mercy Street, is the most similar to me and was not hard to write. Victor is so different from me that it was a real stretch. I would probably disagree with this guy about the color of the sky. I share no values in common with him. I find a lot of his ideas scary and repulsive. And yet in writing that character, I had to take his side, at least for a while. You have to. Writing a character, it's kind of like being an actor. You know, an actor doesn't pass judgment on the character. She inhabits the character. She becomes the character. And to do justice to all these characters, that's what I had to do. So for at least that period of time, when I was writing the character of Victor, I had to see the world through his eyes and take his side, you know, adopt his values. Really what I try to do is just write every character the way they would describe themselves. So Victor's reasons for being opposed to abortion are not the usual ones. They're not what you expect. He's not a religious person. He's not a Christian. His reasons for opposing abortion are much darker. They're really twisted. And I wanted to write this character the way he would explain himself to somebody he didn't know. So that's what I tried to do. And so all Victor's really creepy motivations, his really disturbing ways of looking at women, I had to represent all of that the way he would explain it if he were here in the room explaining himself.
I have told you what a wonderful writer she is, and I think you should hear some of them.
Oh, well, thank you. I will read a few pages from early in the book. These concern my main character, Claudia, who is a counselor at this clinic. This is a scene that takes place, she's on her lunch break, and she's having lunch with her ex-husband, who is a friend. Little backstory, right before Claudia is supposed to meet him, she gets a call on the hotline from a guy who's really scary. He sees that his wife has been calling this phone number, and he demands to know, you know, what is this number she's calling? And Claudia doesn't tell him because, well, there are HIPAA laws that you know, protect patient privacy. So she's just had this very unsettling experience with a caller, and she rushes out to meet Phil for lunch. The deli was packed at midday, hungry people lurking in the vestibule. The overflow crowd spilled onto the sidewalk. Elderly couples, women pushing strollers, loud-talking men in suits. All day long, the place smelled of breakfast, bacon and coffee and fried potatoes. Every few months, Phil dragged Claudia there for lunch. As far as she could recall, he was the only person who'd ever cared what she ate. When they were married, it drove her crazy. After their divorce, it was the thing she missed the most. He'd been her college boyfriend, first lover, starter husband. They married the summer after graduation and lasted 2 years. She was a divorced person. It was her natural state, preferable, she felt, to either alternative. Marriage didn't appeal to her in any way, and yet she was glad to have tried it. If she were 43 and never married, she might attach undue importance to the fact. Her never marriedness would seem the root of all sorrow, the cause of every small dissatisfaction in her fortunate and mostly happy life. "Sorry I'm late," she said as they waited for a table. "The phone rang just as I was leaving. It got complicated." She explained about the caller, the angry husband. "I don't like the sound of this," Phil said. "Be careful." What would careful look like? It was an honest question. At the clinic, they took every precaution imaginable. She felt incapable of greater care. "I'm serious, Claudia. What are you going to do if he shows up there?" "Oh, he won't. People say things on the phone that they would never say to your face. Honestly, it was nothing." "You said that last time." "Last time was also nothing." "If I were you," Phil said, "I'd get myself a gun." "Seriously? Can you seriously imagine me pulling a gun on someone?" "You do what you had to do," Phil said. "I would lose my shit." They had known each other 25 years. How could he not know this? It suggested that he hadn't been paying attention, that he had no idea who she really was. They slid into a booth and glanced at the menu, which Phil knew by heart but studied for pleasure. Early in his career, he reviewed restaurants for the Globe and had single-handedly put several out of business. Fake overpriced dim sum, a gastropub in Somerville that served an appetizer of flavored steam. But the deli never disappointed. The dumplings and brisket and homely kugels were, to him, the pinnacle of human culinary achievement. Claudia could remember when these foods seemed exotic to her. In rural Maine, pre-internet, even bagels were unheard of. It wasn't like that anymore. No place was. It was hard to believe now how little they had known of the world, how isolated they'd been. "I drove past the clinic the other day," said Phil. "There must have been 50 people out there." 36, she said. "It's Lent. They'll be out there until Easter." She reached for her phone to show him a photo. "See, no more buffer zone. Now they come right up to the door." For years, protesters had to stay 50 feet away from the entrance, a Massachusetts law recently overturned by the courts. Now they could crowd around the door, praying and singing to their heart's content, cursing and screaming and speaking in tongues. Their insults and obscenities were protected under the First Amendment. Unless they laid hands on a patient, or threatened to, or physically barred her from entering, the law was on their side. It was up to the patient, whatever her physical or emotional condition, to muscle her way through. When Claudia explained this to Phil, he looked incredulous. "You're kidding. That's legal?" The son and grandson of attorneys, he believed reflexively, unconsciously, in the overarching wisdom of the law. That the law could be short-sighted or capricious or simply wrong was an impossible thought. "It is now," said Claudia. "Do I like whitefish?" "That's outrageous. Somebody's going to get killed." He had an eye for calamity, an actuarial sense of all that could go wrong in life. Identity theft, radon leak, Bell's palsy, tsunami, heat stroke, spinal meningitis. It seemed like an exhausting way to live. "Claudia," Phil said, "are you sleeping?" "Right now." "In general." "I sleep enough." This was a blatant lie, but talking about her insomnia made her anxious, which in the end made it harder to sleep. Phil signaled the waitress. "You can't keep this up, you know. That job is killing you. I don't know how you can work there." It was tiring to have these conversations. "Look," Phil said, "I'm on your side. You know I have no problem with abortion, assuming there's a good reason." "There's always a reason," she said. Define good. The reasons were many and varied. Occasionally, a patient would volunteer hers, as though trying to convince herself. My son is autistic and daycare won't take him. I can't handle another kid. I got fired, evicted. I got into law school. I'm afraid to go off my meds. I just need to finish high school, chemo, probation, my PhD, my tour of duty. My mother would never forgive me. I want a different kind of life. This you'll recognize. Last summer we had a call on the hotline, she said. A 603 number, so New Hampshire. She said that if her ex found out she was pregnant, he would come to her house and shoot her kids. Phil looked up from the menu. Now, it's possible she was delusional or a compulsive liar. Honestly, I have no idea. All I know is what she told me. Out the corner of her eye, Claudia saw at last a waitress approaching their table. The point is, what's a good reason? Who gets to decide? Phil ordered the brisket.
One other thing I wanted to ask you. When I was doing some rereading for this, particularly in Heat and Light, about fracking, to give us a context for fracking. You told us something about 3 Mile Island. You told us something about the Iraq War. You mentioned 9/11. And so one of the questions I had for you was, how do you decide where a story begins? And then I opened Mercy Street. And the first sentence of Mercy Street is, it's hard to know ever where a story begins. So how do you make those decisions on what you're going to include? Do you know at the beginning, or do you get halfway through and say, oh, I have to tell them this?
You know, I'm a bad planner. I know writers who outline an entire book before they start to write anything. I've never been able to do that. And usually I know maybe one event in the story that I'm writing toward, but I never know the ending. I never know how it's all going to wrap up. And if I think I know, I'm usually wrong. Because what happens is, if I have a thought about the ending before I start writing, I don't know the characters very well yet. It's in the process of writing that I come to know these people. And so if I have this preconceived idea of how the story should end, I get to that point and I realize, nah, she would never do that. Like, I know Claudia better now. She wouldn't do that. I know Timmy better now. He wouldn't do that. So it's in the process of writing that I figure out who these people are. And the trajectory of the story changes as I get to know them better. You know, by the time I'm done writing, these people are as real to me as my own family. But of course, it doesn't start out that way. I have to do some writing first. So really the first 6 months or so, I'm just writing about the characters. I'm not trying to write chapters yet. I'm just trying to figure out who these people are. And you know, that decision about where the story begins, I usually get it wrong on the first draft. I usually begin in the wrong place. Mercy Street is unusual because where the novel begins is exactly where I started writing. And it grew very much out of my experience volunteering at this clinic, where every time I showed up for a shift, I had to fight my way through this gauntlet of protesters. I mean, sometimes there was just one guy there holding a sign. And sometimes there were, 36 people on Ash Wednesday. But it was just built into the experience of volunteering there. And I was only a volunteer. I was there 1 day a week. I think about the people for whom this is a daily reality, that you have people in your face, yelling at you, insulting you just for showing up to work. And so that's where I started writing, with Claudia arriving at work. And, by some miracle, that ended up being chapter 1. That's never happened before.
We've got just a couple more minutes, so I guess what I want to ask you is what I should have asked you that I didn't think to. What would you like everyone to know about this book?
Oh, Dottie, you ask great questions. I think you asked me everything.
Well, then I'll ask you another question. Your first book, Mrs. Kimble, which is the story of 3 different women who in sequence married the same man, a slightly inadequate man. But that book was published 17 years ago. And a lot has changed in the publishing industry in the last 17 years. Has that changed the way you write? I have talked to other authors. Chris Bourgeois, for example, has said that he was spending more than 30% of his time doing marketing rather than writing. So have you had to change the way you work because of the changes, or are you just a fortunate author that everybody lets do whatever she wants to do?
Oh, I don't know. I think I'm just a stubborn author more than anything else. My way of writing hasn't changed. It is true that when a book comes out, more is expected of a writer now because there is social media and there are more things you can do. It is expected that you will do them. And I mean, I do a little bit of it. I do it badly and grudgingly, honestly. I don't think I'm particularly good at it, but I do a little bit. And I will say that the upside of that, and particularly during COVID, is that it lets you stay in touch with readers, even when we're all locked in our houses and you can't go on a book tour. So, there is a silver lining to all of that. It is very time consuming. And in a lot of ways, it's the enemy of writing. It is exactly the opposite impulse of writing a novel. I like the writing part of being a writer. I like sitting alone in a room for years on end with my imaginary friends. I realize that is not everybody's dream, but for me, that's a great life. And so it seems to me, all the qualities that make you enjoy that kind of life are the very qualities that make you really bad at promoting books. It's hard to do both. It's hard to be the kind of person who can promote a book and go out there and put on a show, and also be the kind of person who can sit alone in a room for 5 years and write a novel. So, we're asking kind of an impossible thing of writers, that you be good at both of these things. I don't know that I'm good at both of them, but I definitely am doing more of the, the book promotion than I used to do. Yeah.
The other thing, other than sitting in your room writing, I know that you write about things that you know something about, but no one can know the details that you put into some of these books. I'm thinking particularly about Heat and Light, which has incredible. I mean, if you want to know how an automatic atomic thing works, you can just go through, and she talks about what happened at 3 Mile Island. So you must have to do research. Is that something you enjoy, or is that just something you have to do to be able to sit alone in your room?
I love doing research. The real problem for me is I have to cut myself off. I could do research for years on end and be very, very satisfied by it and not notice that I'm not actually writing anything. So I do have to pull the plug on that eventually. I love the research part. Heat and Light was a book that could have taken me 10 years because I got so embroiled in the research, and I had to be able to write with any authority about that subject. When I started writing the book, I knew nothing about fracking. And it wasn't that I was dying to write about fracking. It was that I was invested in writing about that community and those people. And so something that transformative that happened to that community, you bet I'm going to write about it. But in order to do it properly, I had to do some remedial self-education. I had to ask a lot of really stupid questions of very smart people. And that process went on for a long time. That book took some time, and I think a solid year of it was just doing research. I had a lot of conversations with guys who work on drill rigs, for example. I did not know how a drill rig works, and now I do.
And if you read that book, you will too.
I know that's not very enticing, right? Like, you're not all going to run out and buy Heat and Light so you can learn how a drill rig works. What I did learn is that guys who work on drill rigs are really fascinating people. And it was a discovery to me. That book was full of discoveries for me. I knew a lot about the place, that this place in Northern Appalachia that's modeled on my hometown. But part of what was interesting about Heat and Light is that it brought all sorts of different people to this place that does not normally attract tourism. I wrote this line, I think, in Baker Towers. You're born in that town and you either escape or fail to. And it's not a place that people come to until this fracking phenomenon happened. And then all these, drilling crews were coming from Texas and Louisiana and Oklahoma and living in this town for a long period of time, for more than a year. And that was interesting to me, like what happens to this place that has been so insulated from the outside world when suddenly there's this influx of foreigners, you know.
And I have a lot of other things I'd like to ask you, but I think it's time we open this up to our audience. So Sally is going to deal with both people who are on. And so if you have questions here,
Yep.
Sally is going to.
Let's start in the room, and if you can speak loudly, that will help people on Zoom understand what you're saying. Anybody want to start us off?
I'm going to continue talking if you don't come up with questions.
So this was the first book that I read of yours, and it was a page turner for me. I couldn't put it down. Loved all your characters, and it really opened up some avenues of how people think about abortion that maybe I didn't think about before. I did have one question about Victor. When he was in that accident in Western Mass, and then he was in the hospital.
No
I was just
spoilers.
wondering, he did
Spoilers.
have.
Spoilers, spoilers.
But you can ask me later and I will
Okay,
answer
I'll
that.
Sorry,
It's
sorry.
okay, that's all right.
So I also had a question about Victor, which I found perhaps you can answer without giving it away. His unique, I found it unique, opposition to abortion. Where did you come up with that? Is that's a thing?
That's a thing.
Okay.
So I'm happy to talk about that. And I don't think it's truly a spoiler because it's pretty central to the Victor character. And you find out about it very, very soon after you meet Victor. So his reasons, as I said, for opposing abortion are not religious. He's a racist. And this is a guy who feels like an endangered minority. You know, he's an old white guy and he feels that he is becoming part of a minority group in what he sees as his own country. And so he's really concerned about birth rates. From his point of view, the real problem is that white women are not having enough children. And women of color are having too many children and the numbers are off. And, you know, he has this thought he has over and over again, like a refrain, it all comes down to numbers. It all comes down to numbers. And he's really obsessed about this, about birth rates of people of different colors. And so his idea is that white women need to stop having abortions. It's fine if everybody else does. So it's clearly not a spiritual argument in any way, quite the opposite. And yeah, that is the thing. So when I was developing this Victor Prime character, I did a lot of, poking around online. And wow, if you dig deep enough, there's a lot of scary rhetoric floating around out there among people who are opposed to abortion. And I didn't make that up. That's a thing. There are people who think this way.
This is not so much a question about your writing, but your own experience as a volunteer. Do all of those people converging on the patients coming to the door ever prevent anyone from having an abortion?
No, it doesn't happen. But they really do. They're bullies, and not in every case. There are plenty of peaceful protesters, but there are also plenty of bullies. And when you think about it, you're really cornering women at a really difficult, vulnerable time. There's one passage in the book where I talk about a subset of the patients Claudia counsels at the clinic. She calls them the latecomers. And these are women who are almost at the cutoff of 24 weeks, which it was in 2015. It was an absolute cutoff in Massachusetts. You could not have an abortion after 24 weeks of pregnancy, no matter what. And so Claudia sees a certain number of patients who come in at 22 weeks or 23 weeks, and they're quite far along. And the reason they waited so long in pretty much every case is they got some really horrible test results. So a lot of these women are over 40. They're very much pregnant by choice. They desperately want to have a child. Many of them have had fertility treatments. They've spent, time and money and anguish in this quest to have a child, only to find out that they're carrying a fetus with a fetal brain tumor or a fatal heart defect, a non-viable fetus. And so you don't get this information until you're quite far along in pregnancy. Those are the latecomers. And those are some of the patients who come to the clinic for their procedures and have to deal with bullying outside, you know, and being threatened and, you know, with damnation and being prayed at. And, you know, and as Claudia reflects, and excuse my language, she was meeting these women on the worst fucking day of their lives. And if you are in this really tragic situation, it's unconscionable to me that it should be okay for you to be bullied by strangers outside a medical facility. But the law allows it, First Amendment.
As a writer, not as a volunteer, have you been threatened or picketed since the book has come out?
You know, I'm glad somebody asked that question. I will tell you that fear, and for those who didn't hear it, I'm going to repeat the question for the folks on Zoom. Have I been, you know, threatened or bullied since publishing this book? I really worried about it. I will tell you, because I know that there's some pretty crazy people out there in the world. And the fear of publishing this book made me drag my feet. I really didn't want to publish it. I wanted to write it. I wanted to exist in the world, but the prospect of publishing it was really freaking me out. And so I probably would have finished the book a little faster had I known it would be published into a global pandemic in which everybody's going to be stuck in their houses. They'll never meet anyone. You know, I mean, this is only the second time I have done, I guess maybe now this is the third, I've done an in-person event for this book, which has been out for 3 months already. And normally by this time, I mean, sometimes I've done a 40-city book tour and I've done lots of readings in bookstores and met tons of readers. Not this time. It's been pretty much done virtually. I've done most of my book events on my laptop at home. So I've in fact met very few people, period. And I needn't have worried about that apparently because, you know, I'm not meeting those folks.
I have a question from Zoom. Mary Jo is asking, are there any sympathetic people who oppose abortions in your books? You talked about Victor.
Well, you know, the only 2 people who are opposed to abortion in my book are Victor and another character I've not talked about yet, Anthony, who I think is quite sympathetic. To those who've read the book, I'm seeing some heads nodding. I find him quite sympathetic. I should talk a little bit about Anthony. So he is a guy who protests outside the clinic, and he does so for religious reasons. He is an observant Catholic, and he's a guy for whom the church is a lifeline. He's a daily churchgoer, goes to mass every morning. A little bit of Anthony's backstory. He's a guy who suffered a traumatic brain injury while he was working on the Big Dig. And so he's been disabled since then. You know, he's 40 years old. He lives with his mother. He's not able to work. He's on 100% disability. And his only real sense of community comes from the church, from the mostly older women he sees every day at mass. And it really is, you know, I think an important point to make about faith and about church going generally. It does provide that community, or it can. And it really does provide that for Anthony. So he is certainly an opponent to abortion, and I think extremely, extremely sympathetic.
Anybody in the room with questions? Curious what you're working on next.
You know, this question, I always feel bad because I always punt. I'm too nervous to talk about anything in progress. I do have a little something that I'm writing. I don't yet call it a novel. I call it a little something. It's a story I started writing a few years ago. I was in China for a few months. I was in Shanghai for 3 months. And I was ostensibly working on Mercy Street while I was there, but I found it impossible to channel Boston, Massachusetts in Shanghai. It cannot be done. So I found myself fascinated with that place and starting to write something set there. So that's the little something I have going. I don't know what it will be. It might be a novel, it might be a novella, it might be a short story. It might not be anything. It's still early days, but that's probably the next thing.
Do you have a preference between writing short stories and novels? Is there one you enjoy more than the other?
Oh, yes, I like the one I'm not doing at the moment. Yes, so when I'm working on a novel, all I want is to be writing short stories. And as soon as I finish a novel and start writing stories, I only wish I could be back in a novel. You know, whatever I'm not doing looks so much easier than what I'm struggling with at the moment.
So I have another quick question. You said, so you're from Appalachia, and there's many transplants here to the Boston area. I'm from the Catskill Mountains in New York. What brought you to this area, or how did you escape like you said that some people do?
Yeah. Well, you know, it wasn't a straight line for me. I'd lived a bunch of other places before I came to Boston. So, you know, I lived in France for a little while after college, and I lived in Florida for a while. I lived in New York City for a stretch. And then I went to graduate school at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And that was my last address before I came to Boston. I really loved my 2 years in Iowa. I was doing this MFA in creative writing at this wonderful program, surrounded by these very talented, committed people. I really loved being there. But I knew at the end of the 2 years, I wasn't going to stay because most of my circle were, you know, other grad students who were also leaving. So I had the extreme luxury of just moving to a place I liked. You know, I had sold Mrs. Kimble, my first novel, while I was still a student at the Iowa Writers Workshop. So I didn't need a job. I didn't want a job. I wasn't looking for a job. I didn't have a boyfriend or want a boyfriend, wasn't looking for a boyfriend. I didn't have kids. I didn't have pets. I didn't have plants. I had just nothing else in my life besides writing. And I was completely portable. I could go anywhere. And I came here because I love it. And it's one of the best decisions I've ever made. It's a great place to be a writer. You know, you're close enough to the business of publishing that you can get on a train and get into New York and have lunch with your agent, and then you get to leave. And, you know, Boston has this vibrant writers community. There are a ton of writers here. If you throw a book out a window in Harvard Square, you will hit a writer. So there is a real sense of community. But when you run into other writers socially, you know, people aren't talking about who got a big book deal or who won a big prize or who got panned in the Times. People talk about what they're reading. So it's really, it's such a good-hearted writing community, and people are serious and care about their craft. And I really love it. It's a great place to be a writer.
Would you like to tell us what you're reading?
Yes. Well, I mean, I'm not always that excited in answer to that question because lately I've been kissing a lot of toads in my reading. You know, the last several novels I started reading did not thrill me, but then I read one that thrilled me. And the writer is Claire V. Watkins, and it's the best title ever. Get ready for it. The title is I Love You, But I've Chosen Darkness. And the book is as good as the title. I cannot recommend it enough. It's absolutely wonderful. I just finished it a few days ago. So yeah.
And thank you all for coming. I think now we're going to give you the opportunity to say hello to Jennifer personally and hopefully to buy a book. I just want to point out that Mother's Day is coming. There would be no better gift at all than an autographed copy of one of Jennifer's books. So thank you again. And thank Jennifer. This is just delightful.
Thank you, Dottie, for that wonderful conversation. It just feels so good, doesn't it? I don't know. Just having this program feels so good. So thank you both. That was great. And so you know about the books we're selling. You know Jennifer will be signing. We have the refreshments. We have the exhibit. I just wanted to let you know about an event that's coming up on May 7th. In case some of you don't already know about the Maynard Art Walk that's happening on the evening 5 to 7:30 on the 7th. That is happening. There will also be some events here in the afternoon. There will be an exhibit. This will go away after April 30th. And a new exhibit comes in that is over 20 artists from Art Space. So it's a group exhibit, and they'll have a reception on the 7th at 1:30 in the afternoon. And this will be followed by a concert of music students from Art Space and Indian Hill Music School. So do join us if you can. And thank you again for coming this evening.